Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I have a delightful interview to share with you with Jenna Yeam, who is a senior at Duke University, who's writing a thesis on death doulas, living well, dying with dignity. And she has hosted a Death Café on the campus of Duke University. She's going to tell us all about that, how it went, and give her recommendations for other people who might like to start Death cafes on college campuses. So I know you'll enjoy this one. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel down below. Also, subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. And go to eoluniversity.com/support to find 3 different ways you can make a small contribution that will help keep this channel and the podcast on the air. Thanks in advance if you choose to do that. So we'll move on with my fun conversation with Jenna Yeam. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my special guest, Jenna Yeam. Jenna is a senior at Duke University, investigating what it means to die well and how we can help people die better. This past summer, she interviewed 67 death doulas for her thesis, and now she is organizing student-run death cafes to encourage young people to reflect on their own good life through open conversations on dying with dignity. And Jenna, welcome. And I'm so happy to have a chance to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. Super grateful to be here.
Yeah, I really enjoy talking with younger people who've been called into this work and study. And I think you're probably one of the youngest people I've ever interviewed, being a senior in college. And so I'm really curious about your story and what drew you to this space and to work here.
Yeah, for sure. I think my kind of entry point into the broader death and dying space probably could be traced back to 2 summers ago when I was at the moment interested in studying behavioral economics, and was doing this little remote internship with a startup and thought it would be cool to spend a summer in a town called Mostar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country in the Balkans. And for those who don't know, Bosnia and Herzegovina is where the Bosnian War and the genocide occurred back in the 90s. So this town of Mostar specifically is still recovering and has a lot of reminders and traces of kind of like the loss and the conflict that occurred back towards that tail end of the 21st century, or sorry, 20th century. So yeah, it was when I was spending a summer there working at this one war hostel, and living with this three-generational Bosnian family that I found myself just like talking about kind of what happened there, the history, and also the broader topic of loss and death with a lot of the locals and the backpackers. Because I think that the type of backpackers that are attracted to the Balkans specifically often are kind of in these transitory periods of their lives. Like sometimes it seemed like they were running from something or were just going through a big life pivot. Um, so I think it was just me kind of coming into that ecosystem in a pretty like classic existential young person headspace. And then in that environment particularly made me think about my own good life and what is kind of like the purpose of doing anything with all the chaos that's happening. Um, and all just like the confusing things happening in our world at this time. So, yeah, I would say it was back in that summer. It made me think a lot about kind of how I'm making the most of my time at Duke and what I should be focusing on and like what it means to live a dignified life and um, what it means, what my own good life looks like. And from there, when I left Bosnia and Herzegovina, I went back to a research lab I was working at that focuses on applied behavioral science. And kind of serendipitously, there was a research project that focused on death doulas. It was like a qualitative project. And then at this lab, I learned what is a death doula, and I started helping out with some of the qualitative analysis. And that research project kind of served as a hub where I can continue these conversations, these like largely existential conversations around dignified living and dignified dying, but within the academic context, and with like academic resources of my school.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of my entry point from into the academic space. Like that's now more relevant to my thesis, which is working with death doulas. Hence the lovely introduction. Like in the past summer, I interviewed 67 death doulas
Hmm.
around what is going wrong at the end of life and how they're helping people and their families navigate the end of life. Um, and it's been really awesome. It's been a really awesome experience.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And how a geographic location where a horrific tragedy has occurred can somehow be this this really rich center of people coming together to explore grief and mortality and really thinking about those deeper issues because it's as if the land and the space holds all of that pain for us to enter into and study.
100%. And I will say, in this hostel specifically, there were a lot of Western travelers that were passing through. Um, and like the physical space in Mostar is very much entrenched with traces of conflict from post-Yugoslavia back from the 80s and the 90s. For instance, I remember my bedroom had a grenade launcher in the corner, and
Wow.
entering that space was super jarring. And also, shout out to this hostel. It's called Hostel Miran. Great hostel, great war tour that they provide. Um, Miran, the owner and the person who runs this war tour, was in his teenage years during the war and then during the genocide. So he was in one of the concentration camps, and a lot of his family members were in the concentration camps as well. So the stories that he would share with the travelers, like late at night, when we would all be gathering kind of in the common spaces, were just like extremely eye eye-opening and almost just transporting into a whole different world. So
Wow.
yeah, we were all like very, very lucky to be able to hear these primary accounts from such like a heavy part of our global history and also something that as a US student, we don't learn a lot about within our public school system.
Yeah, so very true. Oh, what a fantastic environment, this little community all living in this space together and having a chance to hear the actual stories from the survivors of that time. That's amazing.
Hmm.
And I don't know if I remember this correctly, but did you tell me before that you had had some sort of an interest in death at a younger age and or curiosity about that?
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, kind of another dimension to this summer, when this was all kind of happening in my life, when I came back from Mostar and all that stuff. It was over like I think it was like a Thanksgiving dinner or something like that, when stories of my family's own experience with death and dying, in other words, my grandpa's passing, back when I was a middle schooler. It's kind of when those stories started to emerge around the holidays and around Thanksgiving time that made me reflect on kind of my position when my grandpa's end of life was unraveling. And I saw a lot of parallels between my position as kind of the granddaughter, watching my mother and my aunts and uncles grapple with a lot of the practical stressors and the emotional distress of an end of life journey. Um, and I feel like I saw a lot of parallels between my position and kind of the death doulas that I was talking to in this role that the death doulas are assuming. Um, and filling all these gaps in end of life care and holding space and being an emotional, practical, and sometimes like spiritual support system, amongst many other things, for these dying people and their families. And I think like leaving Mostar, I also realized that, the end of life is just such a messy process and such a tumultuous experience for everyone involved. And hence it's this need to like have space and also have some sort of advocate for the dying person and also have some sort of kind of like almost an educator to help people be aware of like what their options are and like what to expect during this incredibly scary time. Because looking at my family, I think these stories are emerging around the holidays, like for a reason. It's because there are in some ways like a few scars that have been left intergenerationally past following my grandpa's passing. Um, and I don't think that experience is unique. I
Mm-mm.
think that this is a very common experience, and I think that a lot of the death doulas that I talk to would agree with that as well.
It's so interesting that you had that insight that you kind of got a little preview of the work of death doulas and the role that they play as a middle schooler and I mean, at that time had no clue that this would end up influencing your choices in
Yeah.
college. But it's really, I love stories like that when we see everything coming together, all the pieces kind of fitting together over your lifetime so far and how they end up contributing to what you're doing now.
hmm And
And
it's, I think, like the role I assumed as a middle schooler isn't unique either. Like I think we all kind of adopt some sort of role or uh like adjacent to similar to this death doula. Because the death doulas are emerging for a reason. And I think like my particular experience as a middle schooler just very much subconsciously primed my brain such that after leaving Mostar, the parallels just seemed really obvious.
so
Yeah.
I know you interviewed these 67 death doulas. Did you have a focus for your interviews, like specific things, information you were looking for from the death doulas? And is there anything that you can share with us? I mean, I'm sure you, um, you're not completed with all of that, but anything you can share that you've learned from that experience?
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of entered the interview series focusing on what is going wrong at the end of life and then also how the death doulas are responding. So at the beginning of the interviews, I used a lot of language such as mistakes. Like one of my interview questions was, what is a mistake that patients make at the end of life? Or what is a mistake that the family members may make at the end of life? And in that process, there were a lot of mistakes, or now I use the word frictions. There were a lot of frictions that the death doulas identified that can largely be traced back to people not confronting death and their own mortality, and also their loved ones' mortality early enough, such that once they're actually entering this end of life journey, they're very overwhelmed and they haven't had kind of the bandwidth to fully think about the steps that need to be done on a practical level and also on like an emotional level. And I would add also on an interpersonal level. Because on the surface, like kind of the surface level frictions that a lot of death doulas talked about were family fighting, family feuds emerging around the dying person in their final days or weeks, or a lot of practical things like a will, obituary, or advanced care planning, those kind of documents and those decisions not being made early enough. And then with family members flying in and the dying person potentially quickly entering their final days, it's just such a chaotic and emotionally stressful ecosystem to make all of these hard decisions and make all these uh, do all this practical planning that needs to be done.
Yeah, so you really, it's uncovering all of the consequences of our society's failure in a way to talk about death and dying together, to prepare ourselves to learn about it, and which is sort of a first world privilege in a way because we don't see death and dying before our eyes every day, or we don't live in a location that has experienced that deep tragedy like we talked about before that puts it before us every day to look at and think about. And so we kind of have this luxury of ignoring death until a crisis occurs, and then we're not prepared at all.
100%. And I think it's also really notable that I entered my thesis planning on, doing it within the psychology department. But as of late, I'm doing it outside of my major because I'm pulling from cultural anthropology. Because in the interview process, I realized that a lot of these frictions are traced back to, as you kind of mentioned, these systemic issues of how death has been isolated and shielded from our public consciousness, and also how it kind of intermingles with um, like a more general push for elongating life over ensuring quality of life, and
Mhm.
also like a lack of education and a lack of uh, hubs or figures in the end of life process that are telling people about their rights and like what to expect. So yeah, now I'm like my fantastic thesis advisor is in cultural anthropology, and the my PI, the person I started this project with, is like a behavioral economist and specializes more in psychology. So it's like become this very beautiful interdisciplinary web.
Which is so perfect though, because like our mortality, it's the foundation of everything. And you can see these ripple effects of our denial of death, our refusal to deal with it in every area, as you were saying, the push to prolong life and therefore spending way too much of our healthcare dollars at the end of life and shorting programs that might actually help with quality of life earlier on for other people, because we're so focused on trying to avoid death. And so yeah, it seems to me that it's this foundational problem that affects everything in our lives ultimately.
Mhm. Most definitely. Yeah, most definitely. And like a lot of the death doulas talk about how one big mistake that a lot of people make at the end of life is that they don't seek out this help early enough. Help as in whether it's hospice or a death doula or just more information about what their options are, what steps need to be taken, and what to expect before, during, and after the death event. Because as you're kind of mentioning, it's this aversion to thinking, let alone talk about anything related to death and dying. That's kind of this fundamental thorny problem we have in our society. And it's also not exclusive to the US. Yeah, I would say that it pretty much stands across the world, it seems like.
Yeah, I've often wondered about that, never having really looked at any statistics, but I just know when I've traveled through like Italy, which has this ancient history and the Colosseum still stands and the Roman Forum, like there's so much history. It seems to me like it would be easier to think about death more often because of the physical structures they see, the history that's still alive in their communities. But I guess you're right. Humans are humans no matter what, no matter where we live. And it's just part of our psyche in a way to want to avoid the topic.
Hmm. Yeah. And I suppose like a big caveat is that these are just largely like the more developed westernized societies that I'm thinking of. Yeah. Like I'm thinking of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and how a lot of these themes emerged there as well when I
Mm.
was volunteering over there for a bit.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading your thesis and learning a lot more about what you're coming up with and also any thoughts you have. But I wanted to know more about your decision to start a Death Cafe on the Duke University campus because it seems related to what you've learned from your thesis, and I just wanted to hear about that connection.
Yeah, for sure. So truthfully, my interest in the Death Cafe movement was extremely organic in my thesis development because I think that the big issue that I kind of mentioned a bit earlier is this lack of education and a lack of conversation around death and dying. So, in talking to death doulas and then also working with my fantastic thesis committee, we kept coming back to kind of like how death cafes are emerging around the US right now. So over the past summer and up until now, I've been attending a few death cafes in the area, and I realized that like I'm kind of one of the only young people that are attending these death cafes.
Mhm.
And the larger like issue of our kind of current death care systems and healthcare systems needs to be talked about on university campuses. Because there's like a lot of activism being intermingled with the Death Cafe movement within this like broader social movement called the Death Positive movement.
Hmm.
Um, is that's how I'm referring to it right now. And so that's kind of what inspired me to pitch a project to the Ethics Institute at my university, um, about hosting a death cafe centered around the topic of dying with dignity on the university campus. Because on a value level, I think there's just such a need for young people, especially young people who are at these quote unquote elite universities and who are supposed to be like the change makers, blah, blah, blah of the world, um, to be having these conversations and thinking about like what does dying with dignity even look like? What does that mean? And also what is our obligation as like the Gen Z to do something about it, like within our own lives, and also thinking about, on an equity level, like how can we make dying with dignity an actual right and not just a privilege for the affluent? Because another thing I noticed is that a lot of the death doulas, or many of the death doulas I talk to do come from middle to upper class backgrounds, and a lot of their clients or a lot of their paying clients, I should say, are also middle to upper class Americans. And hence it's kind of like uh, framing this death doula emergence as more of an opportunity for the privileged. So I think like the Death Cafe concept is just fantastic because it's really just giving the people agency to get information and to get connected to resources within their local community.
Yeah, yeah, so true. I love the Death Cafe movement, so I was really excited to see, and I didn't realize that there hadn't previously really been death cafes on college campuses here, that yours was the first or one of the first, as far as you know.
I believe it's the first. This probably should be fact checked, but I don't think there's a whole lot of death cafes. Like since all of this is so new, I haven't heard of any other death cafes being hosted exclusively for young people or on a university campus. Um, I wonder there's probably like variations of kind of this death cafe where maybe there are other conversations around death and dying, but yeah, and also I will say that I hosted this Death Cafe with a great group of students also at my university. There were six of us, so we worked together in kind of seeing this through in this past
Mhm.
week.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, so I know I mean, you've just recently held it, so I'm really curious to hear how it went, who showed up. I'm also curious about how you promoted it and advertised it on campus, um,
Mm,
and how you just let people know what it was and got their interest.
yeah. So we tabled a lot. We just plopped ourselves down at this kind of like communal area on our university campus where a lot of people are passing through. For anyone from who knows Duke's layout well, that's might be hearing this. We were sitting on BC Plaza and just
Mhm.
talked to a lot of students about it. We started an Instagram, so that was big. We just told our friends that, we're doing this thing, that they should follow our Instagram. We had posters, we got cookies and snacks and just gave that to people if they followed our Instagram. And then we also tapped into a lot of different listservs into different departments. We talked to a lot of professors and we talked to a lot of people or professors who have classes that are kind of centered around death and dying or disability activism, things along those lines. Um, and I wish I could say it was very strategic, but I think we just kind of tried to plop uh, what we're doing into as many different channels as we could, as like our own connections within the Duke ecosystem could allow. And then whoever showed up, we figured would like should be there. Because like even just our name, dying with Duke, is
Hmm.
pretty jarring. It definitely isn't for everyone. It's definitely not for everyone. So we kind of figured that the people that show up would be pretty self-selective, and that's how it should be. Um, But
That's
yeah,
absolutely perfect for your first Death Cafe, because
yeah.
I think most Death Cafes get started that way. You have no idea like who will come, what will attract them, why will they come? But it ends up with that feeling like everyone is there um, with intention. Like some are just curious, but everyone has some reason to want to be there.
hmm Most definitely. And along those lines, I think seeing the eclectic student body that showed up, like it was so awesome. It was so awesome because, as you just said, there were definitely some students that had a little bit more existential anxiety and were a bit more hesitant to fully throw themselves into the conversation. And there were definitely people that came in with personal experiences with death and dying and loss. Um, and I think especially for students with the personal experiences with loss, like the Death Cafe and kind of the space that it provided was very much needed on my university campus. That was one thing that the students and I, when we're debriefing afterwards, kept coming back to how it felt like this Death Cafe was very needed. Because I think a lot of people are really scared to talk about death and dying, especially young people. Um, And they're also, it's like, and it's also just like the community aspect with the Death Cafe that is like really, really important, I think. Um, because yeah, it kind of goes back to a previous conversation, but it's just super weird to talk about things related to death and dying to people you don't know that well. It's like hard to get that conversation going. So then having like a holding space, a safe space where people are coming in with the intention of talking about that conversation, I think was really huge.
I think you're so right that there is probably a pent-up need for people who have had a personal experience with death and grief, no matter how long ago in the past or what it was. And especially for younger people, because it isn't normalized for younger people to even think about death because we imagine that all young people are so far away from death, they don't need to think about it at all. Whereas people my age think about it all the time.
Yeah.
And yet, everyone at every age is experiencing loss in their lives. And so, to create this safe space where people can come and just talk about that experience is so important.
Mhm. Yeah. And also, I don't know how many people realize how much like existential anxiety young people have too, especially in like our early 20s during undergrad, hearing about things that are happening in like abroad, all the conflict and all the war that's happening and with the elections and just things yeah, just all these current events. It's like really hard to figure out, I think, how we're supposed to be positioning ourselves and like what we're supposed to make of all this. Like, what's the point in doing a lot of the stuff that we're doing right now? Because it feels like we're supposed to be setting ourselves up to live like a meaningful life or a life that's going to do good. So it's just like that general high level overarching existential headspace that I think a lot of young people are in. Um, and talking about death, specifically dignified living and dying, I think is a fantastic like ecosystem to let ourselves be existential with other young people who are also going through this.
It's so important and to understand that that existential fear, it's part of our humanity in a way. It's something that all of us experience. And so once we can bring it out in the open and talk about it, then suddenly we can make it part of our lives. We can utilize the angst we have to maybe learn more or educate ourselves and prepare more for the future and to make different decisions. And it's so empowering to give people information and to inspire them in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And also I fear I might have digressed a little bit from your original question related
Yes,
to
yeah,
that.
go ahead.
Were we talking about kind of like the big takeaway?
Well, I was just curious, like how many people came and how did the event go and how did you all feel about it afterwards?
Yeah, for sure. So there were 42 students in this classroom.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was awesome. And as I'm saying this, I actually think we may have exceeded the technical capacity of the room. So now I'm leery about saying that out loud. But there was a great turnout, which truthfully is kind of a rarity because on on Duke's campus, there's like a consistent pattern of, a lot of people RSVPing and not showing up. But actually, everyone who RSVP did show up, which was
Wow.
really, really shocking for us. And it was great. The way we structured it was we had like a table of food kind of towards the back. We had some like cookies, some lemonade, and some snacks. So people would come in, they'd check in, grab some food, and then they'd sit at their respective kind of small group discussion table. And at each of these smaller tables, we had one of the researcher facilitators, which is like one of the team members, sit at the small group discussion table with this group of with like five, six other students. And then from there, we had some guiding questions centered around the theme of dying with dignity. So in the beginning, we had some questions like what scares you the most about death, or what word do you attribute, or what word comes to mind when you think of death? And that was kind of just to get the juices flowing, and get people a bit more comfortable. And through the hour-long Death Cafe, we gradually transition the questions more towards like what does dignified dying mean to you, and things along those lines. And at the very end, we administered a survey, basically asking them what they wish we talked about, how their perspectives on dignified living and dying have changed from this Death Cafe experience, and also just how the experience was overall for them. So that was kind of, I guess, could be framed as like the data collection side to the Death Cafe. Um, but yeah, I think the students really, really enjoyed the experience. It also is just something that's so weird to have on a university campus.
Hmm.
Like, I think no one really knew what to expect coming in, but the feedback we got was extremely positive, almost to the point where I've been kind of asking around and reaching out to people to figure out like what we need to do to make the next one better. Um, but yeah, on a high level, I think the students really appreciated the space that it created to have these conversations. And I wish that we had more time to let conversations kind of digress naturally. And I wish the conversations had the opportunity to move with the digression to see what the students really wanted to talk about. Yeah, because like some students wanted to talk about how different religious sects interact with like, notions of death and dying. Like some conversations were definitely leaning a bit more academic. Like it almost kind of seemed like they wanted to have an academic debate, which is so Duke coded. Like I
Hmm.
thought that was hilarious when I heard that like some people were talking about how, oh, I'm an ex-Mormon. I wonder what Christians think about blah blah blah. Like how would you challenge this notion of blah blah blah? And other people were, yeah, wanted to talk about, like how their experience with a loss of a friend or loss of a parent or loss of a grandparent, how that's changed their interpretation of dying with dignity, or like what they wish they knew going into that, or how that experience left scars on their family. Um, and then some people were just kind of like, dang, the thinking about death really freaks me out. So I'm going to sit on the periphery of the conversation, and that's where I want to hang out. And I think like since they're able to do that, that was like the perfect place. That was the perfect thing for them as well. So
And I
just like
think,
yeah, so many different like reasons to coming to it, and like the eclectic tapestry of the attendees was awesome.
oh, I love that. That's amazing. And to get a turnout of 42 by word of mouth, that's incredible. So I hope, are you planning to do more?
Yes. Yeah, most definitely. I mean, right now we're kind of swamped with midterms.
Yeah.
And also we are hosting these death cafes through a research lab called the Regenerative Futures Lab that works with the Ethics Institute at Duke. Um, we did have a few parameters as to like how we need to have these guiding questions to ensure that it stays centered around the research lab's theme for the semester.
Hmm.
There were a few guardrails as to how we could execute and how we could design this Death Cafe. Um, and along those lines, this Death Cafe we hosted in many ways was not true to kind of like the Death Cafes that I've seen being
Mhm.
hosted and facilitated in the Research Triangle area. So I think we want to do a lot of variations. We also just might want to create some like conversational channels for the different quote unquote types of students that came. Like for instance, I think like the team and I all agreed that, the students who came in with personal experience with loss would definitely benefit from being in conversation with other students with experiences with loss, things like that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Wow, you already in just one gathering, you've found so much information that can inform you for the future and for what you do. Were there a lot of administrative hurdles to go through to be able to schedule it or um
I would not really, not too many. Well, actually, the biggest hurdle was figuring out how to make it work with our schedules.
yeah.
Yeah, that was, I think, the biggest hurdle. I think catering food was a pain in the butt,
hmm
but that's also because that was my responsibility on the team. And there were a few unexpected challenges with that. So my fantastic professor and the person who's kind of our liaison between the student-run lab and also the funding, he ended up just driving me to Costco to get some things. Um, yeah. But yeah, regarding administrative hurdles, I think there weren't too many, fortunately. We also did add a lot of caveats because I wonder if you ask because it can be really sensitive to talk about death and dying with young
hmm
people.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We made this first Death Cafe specifically centered around dying with dignity. So at the beginning of the Death Cafe, I did mention a disclaimer that this isn't a replacement or a replacement for grief counseling, and in no way is it supposed to serve as grief counseling because we are a student-run research lab. And this event is going to be student facilitated, and this event is for you all. So I want you all to have agency over the conversation, blah, blah, blah. Um, but yeah, going back to the disclaimer, we wanted to make sure that students knew coming in that this isn't grief counseling. And if they are in need of something more along those lines, then here are all the resources on our university campus. So we had that whole conversation within the beginning section of the Death Cafe.
Wow. Well, I'm so excited to hear about this because I think Death Cafe is a perfect way to begin these conversations about death and dying because it can meet everyone wherever they are. They can talk about whatever they want to, and we're not just supplying them with information we think is important. They get to bring in their questions and their concerns and and what it is they feel ready to talk about. I think that's really powerful, but a perfect way to begin these conversations on college campuses.
hmm Yeah. And even just the name of Death Cafe it can be fun. Yeah, it can be
Exactly.
fun. Yeah. And I think it's just like the community that it creates is like the most important part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So were there any faculty in attendance or was it only for students?
It was only for students. Yeah. I know a lot of the professors that we've been getting advice from and that have been kind of working with, they definitely wanted to come, but I unfortunately had to tell them no. That because we wanted to ensure that it felt non-hierarchical within the Death Cafe, and we wanted to make it feel like this is, or ensure that it is student run and for the student, um, we only allowed undergraduates and graduate students to attend this cafe.
Well, you and I were talking before we started recording that it would be amazing to see death cafes pop up on college campuses all over the country. So I was wondering if you had any tips, if there's anyone listening who thinks that would be a great idea for my campus, any tips you would share about how to get started or any recommendations?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first and foremost, if anyone wants to start a death cafe, they should 100% reach out to me or connect with the Dying with Dignity Instagram. Because the Dying with Dignity Instagram account we have right now, I think it's called Dying with Duke, Dying W Duke. Um, we're kind of using that as our central hub to facilitate this conversation and ensure that this conversation continues on Duke's campus. So yeah, first and foremost, you should reach out to us because I could talk about the Death Cafe for so long. And also because it just happened, I think we're all still processing everything and trying to figure out like what really worked and what didn't work quite as well. But off the top of my head, regarding tips, I think it's just getting the students together and creating this safe space is the most foundational part of the Death Cafe concept. I think we framed this Death Cafe as part of our research project, but also this Death Cafe can totally exist without any kind of qualitative research methodology or things along those lines. Like, I think that just making a group chat and then getting some students together over food and drink, um, or in a space that feels comfortable for them is like the most important and like nourishing, energizing, and regenerative quality of the Death Cafe concept. So I'd say just start a group chat or start an Instagram account on your campus and see like who finds that eye-catching. Because I think it'll attract the people who need that space as
Hmm.
well.
It's so true. It won't attract everyone, but
Yeah.
it will speak to the people who really need it.
Yeah.
Um, did you utilize the Death Cafe website, like the Death Cafe organization, their website at all when you were setting yours up? I just wondered if that as a resource that people could go to as well.
hmm We did not. We did not. That's actually a good point, though. Maybe if we end up scaling our death cafes or we can allow more people to attend, we would start utilizing that website. But because we just had constraints with the size,
Hmm.
because we're kind of entering winter, we couldn't do it outside. And we also were a bit scared about making the death cafe too big because we weren't sure how it was going to go. Um, because this has never been done before, we weren't fully sure what to expect.
Yeah.
And also, there was just so much interest when we were out on BC Plaza tabling. There was so much interest, and there was so many people who found our concept interesting and eye-catching and said they wanted to attend that we were almost scared that we would get way too many RSVPs and way too much interest, and we didn't have kind of the systems or the workflow in place to, I guess, like kind of redirect them, I guess. Yeah, or tell
Yeah.
them to come.
Well, it bodes well for future meetings. I mean, 'cause some of those people will probably return again because they may want to continue the discussion, but they'll talk to other people and more people will come. So it seems like you have some momentum going there.
Yeah, definitely. I think we were all just so hyped up after the Death Cafe because everyone seemed to really get into the conversation. And so many people came up to us afterwards asking when the next one is and asking like if they can bring in their friends, blah, 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 and like how they can help support this movement and help keep this conversation going. I think it's also just so empowering the fact that it was a student-run cafe and it was only students, because students just so naturally like threw themselves into the conversation and claimed agency and ownership over the conversation, which was super cool to see. So
Yeah,
that feels like an empowering aspect to it too.
definitely. And like the value of introducing these conversations about death and dying and living well, living a dignified life at a younger age, it will change their lives forever. I mean, and it will change their families because now they can go home and have conversations with their parents and grandparents and not be afraid to talk about some of these issues. And they can really facilitate some positive change, I think, in amongst their friends, their family members, and that's what we really need to see. We need to see change happening at this organic level.
Hmm. Hmm. Most definitely, yeah. And that makes me think of just kind of myself and also other undergrad students who, when they think of death and dying, they think of their family and they think of their grandparents, the people in their lives that are in or soon to be entering their end of life. And it also makes me think of how back when I was a middle schooler, I kind of served as this like death doula, not, or not actually as a death doula, but there were just a few parallels in my position in the end of life space during my grandpa's end of life journey. And I think there's like a lot of value within kind of the students' personal lives to be thinking about death and dying at an earlier time. Yeah.
For sure, because on their own trajectory, when they reach an age where they have to actually start making decisions
Mhm.
about certain things or seeking out care for themselves, they will have already been thinking about this topic for so many years that it won't be nearly as intimidating. It won't be as difficult to have the conversations with other people.
Most definitely. Yeah, because that's what a lot of death doulas talk about as well. And like hospice volunteers, a lot of people in the end of life space, they talk about how you're never too young to start thinking about death and dying.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so true. And here you were in middle school, you became aware, you became aware of it with your own grandfather's death and navigating that journey. And
Mhm.
so this is just so powerful. And I'm hoping that people listening will feel inspired to want to start some sort of movement on any college campus that they're affiliated with. So maybe we could let people know how to get in touch with you if anyone wanted just to hear more about your experience.
Yeah, for sure. My I guess my Instagram is one channel. It's just my name with a period in the middle, Jenna period YAM. I'm also on LinkedIn since I'm a senior. I'm a senior in undergrad. I have been firing up my LinkedIn to get a job after I graduate. But and also the Dying with Duke Instagram would be a great hub as well to get in contact.
I can leave links for those in the show notes for this episode. So I'd love to have people get in touch with you because it would be great to just see a ripple effect from just our conversation of lots of death cafes starting on other college campuses. And then I'm curious about do you know what's next? When will your thesis be done, and what other plans do you have beyond that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I know I want to do something. Okay, in broad brushstrokes, I know I want to do something in the death and dying space after I graduate. Right now, I feel like I am very knee deep in this kind of ethnography space and learning about these different organizations in the US and abroad that are kind of challenging these big system issues that we have in our end of life and death care, um, yeah, industries. So I think some sort of ethnographic work around how people are dying around the world is definitely something that I'm considering. Also, just partnering with organizations in the US as well that are doing fantastic work and coming up with innovative regenerative models for end of life care. I think those are, yeah, partnering with those organizations is something I am heavily considering right now. Um, yeah, I'd say those are kind of the two things I'm thinking the most about.
So you're open to all connections.
I'm open. I'm very open.
Mentors, death doulas, college
Uh-huh.
students, whatever, with and ready to share what you've learned. And
Yeah,
I'm excited to read your thesis when it's done.
thank you. Yeah, hopefully the content I generate in developing my thesis doesn't just sit in the archives of my university. I'm hoping to kind of reform them into different like blogs or just pieces such that actual people can read it.
That'll be fantastic because I think it's really important to share all that you've learned and share all this work that you've done. So I'm excited to learn more about it. And maybe you can come back on the podcast when it's done and we can help disseminate it a little bit to people to read.
That'd be awesome. Yeah. 100%. 100%.
Well, thank you so much. It's just been a delight to talk with you. And I feel really excited to just know that there's this movement is happening on college campuses and to do anything I can to help support it and help it move forward. So I'm grateful to you for coming and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. This is so fun.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's been a great conversation and we'll have more. I'm looking forward to just following your work and seeing what comes next.
Thank you. I'm excited for this movement. I think big things are happening.
I,
Yeah, I
I
think
think
things
you're
are happening.
you're exactly right. And it's the right time. We really need this right now.
It's definitely. Yeah. Thank you,
Well,
Dr.
yeah,
Time.
thank you. Take care. Mhm.
Mhm.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jenna Yeam and that you'll pass it on to anyone who might be interested in starting a death cafe on a college campus. It would be great to see some momentum behind that. And so share this conversation where Jenna gives her contact information so that other people can find out about how to do it and start their own death cafe. We all really appreciate that. I'll be back next time with another interview. So until then, take care. Bye bye.